today's going to be stream times two to keep me focused. Superhuman Life. Superhuman Life A. Maybe that's better. Okay. Hi. Anyway, I'm working on a couple episodes. The Superhuman Life is what I'll be doing right now. And then I've got a short that I need to do. So I have a little bit of work in front of me, working on doing a little late night thing. And I hope you get something out of it. As I said in the description, I probably won't talk a whole lot. Mainly just so that I can stay quiet to respect my wife trying to sleep down the hall. Okay, thanks.
Annie, welcome back to the Superhuman Life.
So glad to be here.
Yeah, you're joining a short list of returning guests. We're episode 165 here with you, and we've only had Larry, one of my other business partners, Josh. We've had Dr. Trish on multiple times. We've had one of my other great friends. So you may be only the fifth or sixth person that's been a returning guest, which the audience should know then that we're going to be bringing some fire today. So welcome back. Excited about the conversation.
Me too. Thank you for letting me bring the fire. It's always fun.
Last time we got deep into how the trauma in our lives is often the story that we tell ourselves. We got some real practical tips for the audience and the men out there. Today I wanted to dive more deeper into the impact that trauma can have on our relationship. And I think maybe the first question I'd like to start with is, what role, if any, does what you call childhood trauma or any trauma in our life play in our attraction, or who it is we actually desire and seek as a partner?
Oh goodness, this is a good one, because let me tell you, what I've noticed from working with couples in their trauma and then also in business over the last 15 years is that you will actually attract either someone who has a similar trauma to you, or you'll attract someone whose trauma syncs up perfectly with your trauma. And what that means is that for most of us, when we are in a relationship with someone, it's almost as though we're healing partners for each other around our trauma if we allow that to occur, which is actually, I think, a very beautiful thing. So if you think about it, even when you're dating, each person you meet is a way for you to heal a certain aspect of a trauma in your life. And then as you heal that aspect of the trauma, you actually up level to the next person and you work on something new. So it's a very fascinating thing to look at how trauma impacts the relationship and then also who you attract because of your trauma.
So is there ever a point that somebody could reach then where they're so fully healed that the trauma is no longer having any impacts on the relationship?
I don't know if it's that you're so fully healed. I think what it is that you have a good enough level of communication, a strong enough level of vulnerability with the person you're in a relationship with, that their triggers don't prevent you from doing the work. Because sometimes when you're in a very conflictual relationship, it could be very passionate, but you could also have a lot of triggers around the other person. And so what I found is it's not that you're getting to a point where trauma never exists anymore. It's just that you're so aware of the triggers you both are, if you've done the work together, that, say, for example, like if I was in a relationship and I had a meltdown around feeling really stressed out about something work related, the person might be able to come over to me and be like, I got you. We're going to be just fine. Don't worry. And in the past, if someone had said that to me when I was in a more masculine state, I might have lashed out. But now, because I've done the work in my masculine, the work in the feminine, that was linked to my trauma, I might be like, I totally get it. Thank you. That's wonderful. Right? So there's the reaction that you'll have no matter what. You'll feel the reaction come up around the trauma, but how you handle it with your partner is different based on how much work the two of you have done with each other.
Now, what are some unhealthy ways that people would handle that with their partner?
Well, unhealthy ways, I was working with a couple the other day, and one of them has a lot of triggers around money. And so whenever money was brought up, he would place it on the other person to say, well, you need to help me with this because you have all this money and I need your support. And she felt very much like, I can't give you any more money because if I do, it's going to be a massive trigger for you. And so what I supported them on is, okay, instead of walking into the trigger point with him, stay neutral and don't react or respond to where he's going, and let him observe himself be in this trauma loop. And if he can observe it and say, wow, I've done that now 5 times, I don't know if I want to go there again, and you stay neutral, then you actually have a chance of helping the person see that their behavior is not linked to your behavior. It doesn't have to be. So that's called interrupting the pattern. And that's what we're always looking to do with the trauma, because if not, both, she could get triggered from him being triggered, and then all of a sudden they're in a massive ramp up where both of their masculines are fighting, even though that's the farthest thing from what they want to experience with each other. So that's where you can fall into a little bit of trouble if you let your trigger point or your trauma amp up into somebody else's trauma, and then you're both fighting for no reason other than you're stuck in a trauma.
You brought up the masculine feminine multiple times already here, and I know that's been a big role of the work that you've done on yourself as, an age-driven, entrepreneur woman that has, age-driven, entrepreneur woman that has, set on a mission to tackle the world. Like, you have to in your day-to-day life step into that. And you and I had personal conversations about how you kind of worked through this on your own. Curious as to what role the masculine and feminine is playing in just trauma in general? Is it always going to appear in these kind of polarity dynamics?
Well, I think the masculine and feminine, people have so many traumas around those two things, and you see that as a pattern that exists within relationships, right? Because
Do you have examples?
yeah, so for example, let me think of the best one to use here. So I would probably say the best example I would give you is that because society has created a much more masculine attraction for women, right? We're given more opportunity now. We're able to take on more. We're more likely to be leaning into that masculine piece and not leaning into that traditional feminine piece. And so when you meet someone and you start getting into a relationship, a woman might very much emasculate the man that she's with without intention, just because she's so used to having being that forceful with that push energy all day long in her job. So what's really important for most couples is to be able to take the masculine out of the conflict so that it's not two masculine heads going up against each other in that conflict. Because what women tend to do is the man will amp up or the woman will amp up. And because a man, when he comes into conflict with a woman, he has to amp his masculine to try to get her back into feminine. But if a woman's been too masculine at work all day long, it's easier for her to dive into the warrior and start fighting so that they're just amping, and you never have a chance to redirect that energy. So that's why I think our society has done a little bit of a disservice in not teaching as much about polarity, or some of us, we haven't had a chance to learn that much about it. But if you can allow your feminine to show up in conflict, and that's really where you want to look at, what does the positive feminine look like versus the darker feminine? You really want to dig into some of those aspects of the feminine and the masculine, so you can very clearly see, oh, I'm in dark masculine. Or the woman will amp up. And because a man, when he comes into conflict with a woman, he has to amp his masculine to try to get her back into feminine. But if a woman's been too masculine at work all day long, it's easier for her to dive into the warrior and start fighting so that they're just amping, and you never have a chance to redirect that energy. So that's why I think our society has done a little bit of a disservice in not teaching as much about polarity, or some of us, we haven't had a chance to learn that much about it. But if you can allow your feminine to show up in conflict, and that's really where you want to look at, what does the positive feminine look like versus the darker feminine? You really want to dig into some of those aspects of the feminine and the masculine, so you can very clearly see, oh, I'm in dark masculine here, or he's in dark feminine here, because that's what causes almost all the conflict off of the trauma.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity here to really zero in and almost get tactical to a certain extent. So, 90% of the audience is going to be men, right? And then with that 90% is probably going to be split. Half of them seeking a relationship, seeking that kind of life partner, and then the other half in a long-term committed or in a marriage. Speaking to the guys that are maybe in a relationship, in a marriage, or in a long-term committed relationship. So this is appearing in their life probably on a weekly basis, right? They're getting into some type of conflict. What are some signs that maybe a guy could look for that the woman is displaying, that she's leaning more into her masculine? And how can we identify if that's trauma-based, if it's situational based, and then what can a guy do? So I know that's a kind of a long-winded kind of three-stage question. Just curious if we can kind of unpack that a little bit.
Sure. So the first thing for a guy to look for is if you feel like she's trying to fight you and to basically push energy into you during conflict. So for example, if she's feeling to you like she's already stressed out or overwhelmed, that's a moment where you have to be careful, because that could very easily amp up into the masculine. Because she's overwhelmed, she doesn't know what to do, she's already feeling frustrated. Normally in those moments, what I tell the men is, I'm like, make sure that you identify the emotion with her, and you're like, hey, I can tell that you're getting really frustrated. Would you like me to give you some time alone? And then the key here is for the man to remain neutral, like that tree, right? If you've ever read the book by David Deida, The Way of the Superior Man, I would tell everyone in your audience, you must read this book. It is the Bible for all men who want to be in a relationship with women. If you read this book, you see very quickly that a man is there to be the tree in the midst of the woman's hurricane or tornado. So if you want to be able to stay in your masculine and not amp her up into more masculine, your job is to remain neutral and to remain as that tree and let her sort of hurricane around you until she peters out. And the only way to really help her with that is to identify the emotion, not to solve anything, but to identify the emotion and validate the emotion. So I can tell that you're really frustrated. I really wish it could be different, but I'm here for you in your frustration. Right? And that automatically, for most women, is sort of a shock to their system, because they don't expect the man to validate the feeling. They expect you to try to solve the problem.
I was just about to say, this has been my history.
Your job is to remain neutral and to remain as that tree and let her sort of hurricane around you until she peters out. And the only way to really help her with that is to identify the emotion, not to solve anything, but to identify the emotion and validate the emotion. So I can tell that you're really frustrated. I really wish it could be different, but I'm here for you in your frustration. Right? And that automatically, for most women, is sort of a shock to their system, because they don't expect the man to validate the feeling. They expect you to try to solve the problem.
I was just about to say, this has been, in my history with this in many failed relationships. It's like you immediately turn into problem solver mode, right? And I always thought that was the masculine way. It's right, masculine energy here to solve the problem, here to fix things. You present something that you're emotionally or in real time struggling with. It's like, I don't care how it's making me feel. Here's the answer to solve it. Now let's go solve it.
But you got to ask for permission first, right? And this is the key for men. The key is, if you can ask for permission, say, hey, I'm validating your feeling. I see that you're frustrated. I'm sorry that you're in this place. Would you like me to solve this with you, or would you like me to just sit here with you?
After the recognition and acknowledgement, hey, I know what you're going through, and sympathizing with it. So acknowledge, sympathize, then ask if you'd like some help.
Correct. Because then, if she does want you to step into the masculine, great. Then you have a very clear opening. You're like, oh, I can go in and solve this now. But if you try to solve it without her giving you permission, first, or without her being open for it, it's going to amp her into masculine again.
Now, what if the guy is? So, are there can there be moments or situations where this can trigger trauma for a man, and that would just cause a whole other slew of problems?
It for sure can. I mean, what I've noticed for a lot of men who are very nurturing and loving and caring, when a woman goes into the masculine, they almost feel like they have to hyper drive into the masculine, even though they're not comfortable there. And so then it becomes an all-out yelling match, because there's almost a terror around having to be pushed into a masculine that they're not comfortable with. And so this is where, as much as we can, as men and women, we get to look at this concept of polarity and start talking to the feminine parts of ourselves and the masculine parts of ourselves, so that we know what those two sides are saying and what they both want. It's one of the things actually when I coach people, I'm like, all right, well, you got a masculine side, you got a feminine side. Do you know what each side wants? Do you know what each side is asking for? And most people have only spent time in want. It's one of the things actually when I coach people, I'm like, all right. Well, you got a masculine side, you got a feminine side. Do you know what each side wants? Do you know what each side is asking for? And most people have only spent time in, say, their masculine. It's a really helpful activity to go back and forth between the two and ask them, well, what do you want? Why do you want this? Why do you think this is important? and then to ask the other piece, the other side, whether it's masculine or feminine, okay, feminine, you just heard the masculine tell you that you can't do the fun thing until you get the work done. How do you feel about that? So there's a dialogue internally that most people don't have between the masculine and feminine that actually helps work through some of that trauma.
Yeah, there's a part of society that is over feminizing men, right? It's almost pushing, this agenda around toxic masculinity. It's bad to be a man. These traits that are inherently what shape the world that we're living in today are being presented as toxic. So there's one side of culture that's trying to over feminize men. But then on the opposite side, you have a part of whether it's media or creators that are over masculinizing men, right? It's like you don't need to tap into your feminine. But what I'm hearing you saying is like a real man, like he needs to understand both and how they work together. So what are some things? I mean, as we kind of explore this inner dialogue, what are some questions that a man can be asking himself to explore his feminine side?
I think, the first way that it's helpful I found for men to explore this is to really have the men look at the relationship they've had with their mother, right? And to look at that relationship and ask, what aspects of that relationship with your mother did you feel connected to? What aspects of the relationship with your mother were challenging for you, right? Because more often than not, the feminine that is within them comes from their mother and how they engage with their mother. So that's a really nice opening point to have them focus on that to begin with, right? And then you can ask them additional questions around, okay, for all the women that you've dated or all the women that you've had an intimate connection with, what did you enjoy about those experiences? What did you not enjoy? Because that gives them the chance to then look at, okay, on many different levels of the
Feminine side.
I think, the first way that it's helpful I found for men to explore this is to really have the men look at the relationship they've had with their mother, right? And to look at that relationship and ask, what aspects of that relationship with your mother did you feel connected to? What aspects of the relationship with your mother were challenging for you, right? Because more often than not, the feminine that is within them comes from their mother and how they engage with their mother. So that's a really nice opening point to have them focus on that to begin with, right? And then you can ask them additional questions around, okay, for all the women that you've dated or all the women that you've had an intimate connection with, what did you enjoy about those experiences? What did you not enjoy? Because that gives them the chance to then look at, okay, on many different levels of the feminine, here are the qualities that I really admire. And then they can bring that into their feminine and say, do I have these qualities? Do I need to nurture them a little bit more? Do I have to understand them a little bit more? Just so that they have more of a balance and they can actually feel what that side of their personality incurs and enjoys.
Yeah, I want to stay on this relationship with your mother for a while. A couple questions I want to ask you. Something we recently started addressing in our program. So, we get guys at all stages and seasons of life. We get guys that are, 40s, 50s that are, have children in their own home. We'll also get a lot of young men that are, maybe living at home. They're breaking through in their early 20s and they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the next step in season for life look like for me? We had two guys in one of our groups. Like it's interesting that they both showed up at the same time, but what they were realizing, and this was through just our weekly calls with them, is that a lot of their struggles or their issue with pornography was stemming from negative toxic relationship with their mom. So these were men that were still being treated as boys in their home, and it made them feel inadequate to a certain extent, and then this would result in them now seeking out and objectifying women through pornography. I don't know if I have a specific question, just curious kind of your as boys in their home, and it made them feel inadequate to a certain extent, and then this would result in them now seeking out and objectifying women through pornography. I don't know if I have a specific question, just curious kind of your professional thoughts and takes around that.
I think that is a direct correlation between women being more masculine, right? Because you can be feminine in the home and run the household in a beautiful way that's connecting, nurturing, and loving. But when a woman takes it to that next level of being
professional thoughts and takes around that.
I think that is a direct correlation between women being more masculine, right? Because you can be feminine in the home and run the household in a beautiful way that's connecting and nurturing and loving. But when a woman takes it to that next level of being hyper masculinized because of bringing work home with her and not having a transition plan for the time between work and connection time, what I find is most people have no transition plan, and it's very difficult for the women to show up in their feminine because they haven't been in practice around it. So for the men that are in that experience with the woman where she's trying to control everything around her, that 100% usually comes from her trauma. But there's got to be.
This was their mother though. So these were grown men that were still living in mom's house. I don't know if that changes.
Well, the problem with that then is, right, when you have grown men who are living in their mother's house, they get to make a decision. Do I want to stay in this environment that I know is not supporting my growth as a human being? Or do I want to, move out of this environment and give myself a chance to not be hindered by the limitation of how the feminine has always showed up for me? And it's a big choice. It's a big choice to make these decisions. But I think, as long as men are willing to really look at the relationship with their mother and decide, am I ready to move out on my own and develop my own aspect of the feminine that's the feminine I want to experience? And it really does heal quite a few things in them for even the relationships of the women that are attracted to them.
Got it. No, I love that. And I don't know if you've seen or witnessed this in any of the work that you've done. I know it showed up in my life in my early 20s, and it showed up in many of the men that we've worked and consulted with. A lot of times at that point, right, it's like, I need to move out. I'm ready for this next stage. But then they begin to seek a woman in their life almost to replace the mother.
And that's a traumatic response, actually. It's a traumatic response because they're trying to fill the void that was left by their mother instead of deciding, what do I want the feminine to look like for me, to give me the most support, not necessarily on the same experience that they had with their mother, even though that will feel most comfortable to them, but for them really to look at it in a mature way. Here's what I would want in a woman in my life, and to make a decision from that point, not from the point of here's what's comfortable because I experienced this living with my mother. But the default would be for these men, without taking some time to be very intentional about what they're looking for in a woman, to then very easily, because they're subconscious, call in women that are very much like their moms. And that's where a man has to decide. Do I want to stay in the old story of what I needed then when I was younger? Or do I want to step into this new version of myself where I can experience more of my greatness with a woman that I intentionally am picking based on a set of values from the feminine that I am choosing and defining?
And what happens when somebody is aware that the story of their trauma is controlling the decisions and actions that they make? So they know that it's there, right? And they know that a part of the subconscious is controlling the way that they show up, but then they're unwilling to look at it. Like where, if we span that out over 3 years, 5 years, a lifetime, where does that lead an individual? I mean, to me, it just sounds like nothing but pain and suffering, but yeah, just curious, like where does that go?
That's very true. I mean, when you're living in the lie of something in your subconscious that's a trauma, it will cause you a lot of suffering. If you're living in the truth, you'll have much more ease. So for the people that don't want to confront this aspect of themselves, they will experience more suffering over time. And that's why for almost every person I've ever talked to about moving out of the home with their mother, whenever that's come up, it's always been, how do we build ambition in this person to understand what the trajectory of this action is going to be in their life 3, 4, 5 years down the pipe? Right? Because in the moment, if you're like, oh, everything's fine, she's cooking me meals, I have a free place to stay, right? You don't really see that over time is going to cause a lot of problems. But when you look at, well, what about when I start dating someone, or what about when I want to increase and do something differently in my career? Then all of a sudden it becomes much more problematic because there's suffering linked to not making a change.
How does one build ambition?
So ambition, you really have to look at, is the current environment satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Then you have to get them to a vision. Okay, what's the future environment going to look like if I keep doing this exact same thing? So in the moment, it might be satisfactory. If I keep doing the same thing for the next 4 to 5 years, what is that environment going to look and feel like? You have to make it very real for people. And you can say, okay, if I keep living in my mom's house for the next 4 to 5 years, how would that impact my job? How would that impact my friends? How would that impact my relationships? Because in order for somebody to change their current environment, they have to understand that in the moment, it might be satisfactory, but as they continue out year by year, that unsatisfactory suffering would exist for them. Because suffering and understanding that that's coming for you is one of the biggest things that moves you into a higher state.
Do you think it's more important to focus on the pain of the status quo, or the pain of staying in the current situation environment, versus like the good that comes out of the new reality?
Well, I know this sounds a little strange, but I almost look at, I like it when people can say to me, okay, in this moment, it's okay, it's satisfactory, but if I keep doing this behavior, it's going to very quickly become unsatisfactory and really problematic, maybe even dangerous, right? So I prefer that in the moment, they're sort of like a little clueless and like, oh, it's not that bad, I think it's fine. Because identifying the pain in that moment, they haven't changed yet, right? They haven't made a move, so it's obviously not that painful. But what is painful is thinking about what their life will look and feel like a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, with the very real repercussions of that same action over and over and over again. Most people don't think of the future, they think very much in the moment and what they're comfortable with. So if we can make them understand and experience that discomfort of what's going to happen over time, then they're more likely to move.
Yeah, we have an assignment early on in a 16-week reboot program where we help them. I think you got to get clear on what it's like. If you've been struggling with a porn addiction for years, 5 years, decade, multiple decades, the first thing is to envision a life without the behavior, right? It's like, so we help them get crystal clear, 5 years, 3 years, 1 year. What can my life even look like in a handful of months from now? And that's the first half of it. The second part is think about 5 years down the road. If this doesn't change, you can look back over the course of the last 5 years and see the progression of your behaviors. You remember where you were when you started. You're not in the same place now. If you took that time scale and you now compound it out over the next 5 years, where does it continue to lead to? And oftentimes the guys looking at their life continuing to get worse is, I never look at it as ambition. I would say motivation or inspiration to now dedicate themselves to the program. So I'm curious with like ambition, because that was the word that you used. How does that differ from motivation or even the inspiration to want to go out and do a thing?
Well, I find that inspiration and motivation is very short-lived normally, but ambition is something that can drive you for longer periods of time, because ambition is almost like I'm going out into the world to prove myself and to show up as myself, versus inspiration and motivation, like, oh, I heard something really cool and I want to do that, or, oh, this inspired me to take an action. But is it a sustainable like progression of actions? For me, ambition is what creates that. Because if you go after your ambition, you're like, okay, this is what I feel when I'm in this space. I want to feel this every day. It's almost like that concept of desired end state that we talked about way back. If you understand the emotional, successful future that you most want to create, it's easy to be in alignment with that every day because it's an emotion that you can feel. So ambition is closer to emotion, I think, to sustainable emotion than inspirational motivation.
What percentage of people, in your opinion, are having their lives ran by, controlled by the unprocessed or unhealed or even unaware trauma?
Well, I think, at least from what I'm experiencing, people that I coach and people that I interact with, almost 95%, right? Because not many people go in and do this work. If they go in and do the work, their path dramatically changes, right? The revenue they can create dramatically changes. Even how they show up can dramatically change. But a lot of people are so comfortable in the old story. I mean, even today I was coaching a gentleman and he told me, he's a big entrepreneur. He's like, Annie, there's no time. I have no time for anything. I'm like, what if that is the biggest lie that's been pushing you into burnout? And he literally was like, if that's the biggest lie and that's not true, everything I've been doing around telling myself there's no time is what's pushing me into this burnout. And if I don't change this, I'll never get out of it. I'm like, that's true. So is it possible that this is the biggest lie right now? Right? So I'll never get out of it. I'm like, that's true. So is it possible that this is the biggest lie right now? Right? So until this moment, he's built a successful company, but there's always conflict and tension and resentment in the relationship, or even outside the relationship, just on the teams that he's in, right? Because he's taking care of everybody else but himself. And so in that moment, right, the trauma has been running him, whether he knows it or not. So a lot of people have no clue that their trauma is running them, even though it's showing up in every area of their life. I'd say 95% of people have trauma that's running them based on their subconscious and based on things they can't see. It's in their blind spot.
I think we got into the biggest lies on the business performance side last time. I think it was, the need to always be productive, right? To be successful. I think that was one of them. I think you and Larry came up with these 4 or 5 lies on the business side of things. Now, since your work has really transitioned more from at least what I've seen into the relationships, what are some of the biggest lies that people are telling themselves in the relationship?
Well, I think one of the biggest lies is that when you're in a relationship with someone, you have to be everything for that person. And that is not true. One person cannot be everything for another individual. And it wouldn't work if they were. And so that's where I think there gets to be a new comprehension and understanding of friendship. And the fact that you might be able to have an extraordinarily beautiful relationship with someone, but you still need friends, right? You can't be an island onto yourself and just be with that person individually one-on-one all the time. So that's a big lie you see in relationships. Another lie that you see in relationships a lot is that that the man has to play a certain role and the woman has to play a certain role. And what I've found is that, polarity is really more important than the roles. There needs to be some clarity on what role you're playing in the home environment as well as in the relationship department. But a big lie that everyone, I think, is stuck in is that when you're the man, you have to play this role. When you're the female, you have to play this role. And that just doesn't work many times. There are quite a few lies in the relationship side that show up. I mean, one of the other ones is that, at least that I've seen for women, is that they'll tell themselves the lie that connection is a chore, right? That serving their husband in a sexual or intimate way is a chore. And they'll believe that because like, oh, it's just one more thing I have to do and it's never going to get me what I want. But the reality is, for a man, if you're able to make him feel like almost like a man or a god with regards to your sexual connection and it's authentic, that actually opens up the very best parts of a man so that he can go after his purpose. He can create incredible things. And so when women will say to me, well, I don't want to have sex with them because it's not going to give me anything I want, I'm like, that is actually going to be the only thing that gets you what you want, because a man, in order for a man to feel, he has to have sex. He has to have that connection. So it's interesting to see how many lies women will create for themselves and how many lies men will create for themselves just not to feel connected in a relationship.
Yeah, we had Tony DiLorenzo. He and his wife Alicia wrote the book 6 Pillars of Intimacy. We had Tony on probably 12 to 15 episodes ago. We kind of got a little bit into this, right? It's like so many people associate intimacy directly to sex. And it's like, that's one form. And I think that's a form for a lot of men, right? That's where we feel most connected, most intimate with our partner. But we need to have recreational intimacy. We need to have emotional intimacy. Physical is different than sexual intimacy. Intellectual, right? So oftentimes was one of the 6. So if a man can provide the 5, 6 pillars to a woman, then oftentimes she's going to feel more loved, more accepted, to then want to give him his, or fulfill his needs and his desires.
And I think it's important too. The one thing I've noticed about trauma, when you're stuck in the trauma, you aren't acting as yourself, right? Because you've got some shield up or something that's preventing you from being authentically you and from being very vulnerable. And so the more you work on your trauma, the more that vulnerability shows up, and the more you know yourself, so that when you're in a relationship with someone, you can very quickly say, I know this doesn't work for me, but I'd be willing to try this, or I'd like to try this, right? It's that vulnerable, intimate connection with yourself that needs to be the foundation, I think, of everything, whether you're a man or a woman. And that comes from understanding your trauma.
What role, if any, does
intimate connection with yourself that needs to be the self that needs to be the foundation. Vulnerable, intimate connection with yourself that needs to be the foundation, I think, of everything, whether you're a man or a woman. And that comes from understanding your trauma.
What role, if any, does physical trauma play in creating, impacting, or affecting our emotional trauma?
So the body holds a lot of trauma. If you've ever read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that's a pretty powerful example, right? And so your body's going to hold trauma in certain places, which will either negatively or positively impact your ability to be intimate with someone, right? So for example, if you've had sexual trauma, you might not be as comfortable being naked, right? You might always want to be covered up. And then you might also not be comfortable having somebody touch you in an intimate way, right? So when you think about sexual trauma, it's not just what's held in your body physically, but it's the emotional attachment to those physical places in your body. So if you can find someone who's a somatic bodywork practitioner or even a polarity therapist, those types of people really help you release the trauma that's stored in the body so that it isn't then linked every time to the emotional trauma.
Guys, so all trauma then has some element of physicality attached to it.
Almost always, your body will hold it in some location until it's released. So even like, I think I used the example before of, the little boy that got on the plane. His mom put him on the plane at 5 years of age. When the plane door closed, he literally believed that moment was the only moment suspended in time. So he got hyper fixated on always being present and never planning for the future. Well, because of that, right, his body became very tense because he was always like in the moment, like, what am I missing? I have to be aware of everything at all times. So the trauma was in his body, even though he wasn't aware that that was how his body was reacting to the trauma.
Yeah, trauma is always going to create this fight or flight response most
Unless you calm
oftentimes.
your nervous system, yes. So there are four pieces of trauma that we all have to be aware of. There's the emotional piece of trauma, the intellectual side of trauma, which is how your brain processes it. There's the physical side of trauma, and then there's the neurochemical side of trauma, which is how the neurochemistry in your brain is different because of the trauma that you've experienced. So that's why for almost everybody who I work with, I always tell them, if you're willing to calm your nervous system first, get yourself out of fight or flight, you can actually access your vulnerability, your courage, more aspects of yourself, which allows you to work through trauma without as much pain, suffering, intensity. So calming the nervous system is a really great way to work on that neurochemical piece.
From my experience, and I'm nowhere near the expert that you are, most people probably tend to live in the emotional state of the trauma. How can a person, maybe are these stages that you work through in the healing, like emotional, then you heal emotionally, then you heal intellectually? So is it kind of a series of steps that you have to work through? And then if so, how do you kind of process?
So it sort of depends. I mean, what I tend to do with people is I tend to get the neurochemical support into their system first to give them a better foundation for any work that they do. And then from there, I tend to go into the intellectual side because for most men, right, logic is helpful. It helps them move from, okay, if I'm thinking this, what does this mean in my actions? So neurochemical first gives a baseline, get them out of fight or flight. Then you go into the intellectual side and you marry that sometimes with little pieces of the emotional, right, because you want to address the triggers, which are the emotional sides of what comes up. And then as much as I can intersperse with that, I help them find practitioners who can work on their body, whether it's massage or acupuncture or somatic body work, or even emotion code practitioners who can release a lot of emotion because men tend to restrict and hold their emotion in, which to restrict and hold their emotion in, which then it's almost like you're putting bricks into your backpack and carrying it around with not experienced emotion. So the more a man can be willing to release some of those repressed emotions, the faster he'll be able to work through some of that trauma. So, being vulnerable and being emotional for a man is actually, I think, one of the sexiest, most amazing qualities, because the more you are vulnerable and emotional with somebody that cares about you, the more connected they feel to you. It's not a weakness with a healthy woman. It's not at all. If more men could let go of vulnerability being a weakness and showed up that way, they'd have more epic love relationships because the woman would feel so emotionally drawn to the courage that they're showing in those moments.
Is there any danger? I mean, this is the world that I lived in for a very long time, and probably there were even points I know my 20s, probably even into my 30s, where I used the gym as an outlet, and I would say it was therapeutic, but really I was going in there just to beat the shit out of myself. And that was what I was intending to do. Not because I didn't like myself. I think that there were elements maybe I didn't love myself. So I don't know if it's from a masochistic perspective, but I'd literally go to the gym and it was like I just want to pound the shit out of my body to where I feel the pain. And having now gotten on the other side of so much of my own healing and processing as much of my past that I've had to, I still love training as much as I did. I get a different thing out of it these days. I can still go as hard. I'm not as strong because I'm not trained to be as strong, but I can go as hard. I can go deeper into sets, and it doesn't need to be. It's painful to the body, but it doesn't need to feel like I'm punishing myself. So I'm not really sure I'm articulating a clear question
I know
here.
what the question is, so I can help with this. So what most men do, and I would just say most because it's the majority of men that I've worked with, is that they have used pain to move them in life. Okay, they use pain as fuel. They use it as momentum. They use it to move them instead of really looking at what is the positive thing that can move them, right? Purpose can move a man. But most men don't spend time on purpose, they spend time on pain. And so what you were just alluding to is the fact that almost every man uses the gym to create some level of pain, and they also link it to negative self-talk, like, I don't be a pussy, you can get through this, be harder, you have to be harder in these different ways, because they don't have an outlet for their repressed emotion. And so instead of feeling all the positive emotions, they link this up to the pain, which is the negative emotion, to propel them forward, because that seems to be societally acceptable. So for all the men listening, if you see yourself doing the same thing where you're really harnessing the pain and using the pain to move you, just know that you're cutting out all the other positive emotions that you could be feeling because you're so hyper-focused on the pain to drive you forward.
Now, is this the same? Would this be almost the same thing as, you see young girls, I knew girls like this when I was in high school that would cut themselves? Is it the same emotional, I don't say the same wounds, but is it kind of...
It's a similar way to feel something instead of feeling nothing. Right? So a lot of people will repress all their emotions and then they'll want to feel something, but because they can't open up all their emotions back up again because they've been repressing them for so long, they'll go into anger or pain because that's the only emotion that you can get to when everything else is repressed.
So if you're aware of it, if you're aware that maybe this is rooted in trauma, it's because it's hard for me to look back and be like, damn, all that time in the gym, all the bodybuilding, all the pain that I put myself through didn't produce any good fruit, right? It shaped me, character development, it shaped me from a physical development. I'm still living off of, it's almost like compounding interest in my 30s now because I spent so much time in the gym. In my 20s, I have to work as hard, I have to pay as much attention on my nutrition because I put in all the work. So there's so much good that I got out of it. To think that okay, I shouldn't have done that. I don't know if I would.
That's not the point. That's not the point. It's not that you shouldn't have done it, right? So the key here is because trauma creates a story and we live into that story, right? We learn skills and we develop certain habits that the world will say are very good for us and we'll experience some of that reward from having built those habits. So for you, going to the gym, you built a habit of health and a habit of really working your body because you wanted to take your body to that next level. Right now, when you do that, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means it's a skill set you developed. So for anyone looking at their trauma, your trauma's going to help you develop a skill set. It's going to also reward you for that skill set. It's going to get you to a certain point. But when you get to a certain point, you realize, wow, the pain that was needed to get me here, I'm not willing to experience anymore. That's when the switch can flip. And you can be like, all right, that was a trauma response. It gave me a lot of great things, but now I'm ready to do something new. I'm ready to look at what would it be like if pain wasn't leading charge? What if it was like love? Or what if it was connection? Right? So it's not that it was bad that you did all those things. It was actually epic and exactly what you needed. But when you reach a point where you're like, that's not working for me anymore. I want to try something different. You reach that point.
This is why when I see the guy in the gym that is in his 40s or 50s, that is still living like a 20-year-old dumb meathead that's punishing himself and hasn't transcended that to go on to do something bigger. He's still chasing the same dream he was when he's 20. There's a place in my heart that I almost feel for that guy that I want to go sit down and have a conversation with him and figure out, dude, what's going on, man? There's something more that you're not getting out of this that is going to lead you to something great in life. I know I spent New Year's Eve with a guy like this, incredibly well-known, successful bodybuilder across the world. People know him, but he's in his 50s, maybe even in his 60s, and it's he's still the same man in person that he was in his 20s. And it's you should have transcended some of these things.
Well, he wasn't ready to transcend until you had the conversation with you. Everybody's on a different journey, right? And so you have to be aware of that when you're on your own journey, it's going to take you time to figure out when you're done with that cycle.
How can a person then know? Are there signs? Are there questions? Like, is there a revelation point that people reach to? For me,
suffering. There's just suffering.
Suffering.
Because you will feel like you are suffering. You will feel like sometimes it's burnout, sometimes it's suffering. But it's the general concept is if you're living in a lie around a trauma, then you will feel more suffering in your life. If you're living in the truth, you will feel more ease and joy and connection in life. And so that's what I always look for. I'm always like, okay, well, where am I experiencing suffering right now? Like, what team am I on where I experience suffering? And then I always look at that. I'm like, okay, what lie am I telling myself about this experience that is linked to trauma? That if I were to reframe it, I would no longer feel that suffering. I mean, I'll get very, very personal on this. Larry and I, we went through separation and divorce, and not because I didn't love him or he didn't love me, but more because our traumas were so intensely linked. And we've done work in the space for 15 years. We couldn't unlink our traumas. We couldn't unlink our traumas. And what was really cool was this year for the first time, he and I were both like, isn't this magical? We're not together, but I love like who he's become and I love the relationship he's in. And I'm so thankful for this beautiful woman in his life who's helping raise my children. And I'm not in a relationship, but I absolutely adore my life. I'm super happy. And I'm like, who would have thought that we would get to this point? But sometimes people have to be separate for their trauma patterns to play out so that they no longer get caught in that cycle with each other. So that's the thing I would say about relationships. You got to either play it out and see where your cycle connects and then decide, do I want the cycle to continue or do I want to do something dramatic and supportive, whether it's learning about your trauma, working on it, or even separating out from it so you don't have to be in it anymore.
That's so beautiful. I'm happy for both of you guys. You two are, literally two of my favorite people in the world. So to hear you share that and how it's, changing and growing for you just makes me so happy.
Yep, it's amazing. It's well worth all of the emotional roller coaster that you go on in the process of the beginning.
Now, with these traumas, linking to each other, how similar is this, in addiction, right? You'll kind of hear the term like codependent, right? It's like you latch onto somebody, you find somebody that is going to almost feed into your behavior. How similar is the trauma linking to a codependent relationship?
It is absolutely linked 100%. So for example, right, my story was that I couldn't be as connected to Larry because if I was connected to him, he might die. And his story was if he caused any problems for me, he would be at fault for everything. So that's like the perfect combination of if I get too connected, then he's going to die. And his whole thing was, well, if I cause any problems, then it's his fault. So now you got two people who literally can't be connected because if they were connected, the trauma loop would break. But it's sometimes very difficult to get there. And that's a codependency because then we became very good at, well, we're working very well with each other. We always contribute amazing things for each other. But that connection point just wasn't where it needed to be. And sometimes you can't resolve a trauma in a specific relationship because sometimes only one person's willing to work on it. The other person isn't. That's the hardest point of the trauma in a relationship is when one person is like, I'm all in, I want to work on this. And the other person says that they don't have any interest in putting in more effort.
So, circling back to the suffering, I think this may be a similar question as to one I asked you personally in Nashville. But let's say, because you said, how does a person know that they need to transcend, this season or this stage of their life? And you're like, suffering, when suffering has gotten to the point, or when there's any suffering around the trauma. And I know I asked you kind of a deeper spiritual question around all big religions. Everything says life is suffering. Buddha will tell you that. Christianity, pick up your cross daily. For me, that is, there's going to be suffering in this world. If all the person knows, is suffering, maybe they were traumatized early on in life, like one of their first memories is that traumatic experience. So for them, life is nothing but suffering. How do they then know that, okay, I got to get out of this when all they've ever experienced is deep suffering?
Well, I think the only way in that moment to get out of it is to look at the suffering and ask yourself, what is the lesson for me here? What is the bigger lesson that the suffering is giving to me? Because you can sit in suffering all day long and not think about the lessons. But the second you start thinking about the lesson from the suffering, you have a chance to open up possibility. So, for example, right, if I know that I was suffering in my relationship and I was like, okay, well, what lie am I telling myself about this relationship? I'm telling myself that, I can't be connected because if I'm connected, something bad's going to happen to this person. So then you start basically looking at, well, is that really true? Is something bad going to happen if I'm connected to this person? And you start asking questions of yourself that allow you to start saying, well, maybe my suffering isn't necessary. Maybe I don't have to be in this place, right? But until you look at the lesson and you start really questioning, is this true? So that's why I always say that one question, this is the most profound question. What do I want to be true? If you look at any suffering and you ask yourself, what do I want to be true in this moment? Do I want the suffering to be true or do I want there to be an alternate possibility? And then you can choose the alternate possibility and live into that, which changes everything. Changes behavior, changes your mindset, changes your action.
What do I want to be true? Love that. And your gift.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm so glad to be part of your life.
Thank you so much.
For the work you do for these men.
Yeah. So you recently kind of had a pivot. You've been working with SEAL teams and Larry building an amazing company over there. I think recently you kind of started to really open up yourself socially. Kind of you got the North Star, Annie, and everything. So as we kind of bring today to a close, I asked you the Superhuman question last time, so we're not going to ask you what your definition of the Superhuman life is. Just tell us a little bit about kind of this rebrand, kind of maybe what the the genesis of really stepping out on your own, and then maybe what you're really looking forward to most in 2023 as we're kind of kicking off the beginning of the year with recording here today.
Sure. Well, I mean, the reason why I stepped out on my own was because I really started to understand that all the work I've done for the past 15 years in trauma, even though I couldn't shift everything in Larry, my partner, I changed thousands and thousands of lives, both men and women. And I was like, well, if I think about what I'm really passionate about, all I care about is the transformation of the human life so that you can see what your true greatness is, so you can step into that and impact the world around you, right? Because you impact one man, it impacts his family, his spouse, if he has a spouse, his children, his business, everything is a ripple effect out from that. And so for me, even though maybe I can't take on thousands of people, I can change the ecosystem of these individuals in a way that is so profound that everything they touch gets to change. So that for me was my mission in this world, to bring that to more people. And I was doing that with leadership and team performance. I still weave that in, but I know now that the trauma is the key to everything. If you can resolve some level of that trauma, every single person that exists in this world can step more into their greatness, which makes the world a better place. So that's why I'm doing. And you can find me northstar.annie on Instagram. I'll do more live videos coming up here in a bit so that you can see and learn from the videos as well.
And what are you most excited about with 2023? Amy?
What I'm most excited about is I'm going to start running a couple of events, and I've got some pretty life-changing experiences in the events. They're going to be small for maybe 20 people, but at a time. But they will be life-changing across the intellectual side of trauma, the emotional side of trauma, the physical side of trauma, and the neurochemical. So you can go to one place to have everything shared.
Awesome. And is on Instagram the best place right now to maybe connect and get updates on that?
That'll be the best place.
Incredible. Well, we'll get all that shared down there, guys. Obviously, if you haven't listened to the first episode we did with Annie after listening to today, make sure to go check out episode 136. We'll link it down there in the show notes. Like I said, we asked you a Superhuman question last time, so I'm not going to end there. But maybe as we bring today to a close, Annie, thousands of men are going to hear this. Whether they're single, they're just newly in a relationship, they've been with their partner, spouse for decades, or they're trying to find that individual. One piece of advice that every man can kind of walk away with today to begin to go down the path of learning more about his trauma, processing it, or even healing. I know it's a big question. How do we pack that into maybe one kind of action step for the guys today?
Here's one action step, gentlemen. Get the book, The Way of the Superior Man by David Deida. Make that your Bible. and do as much learning as you can around what you need to be fully yourself in every experience. Be able to bring all of you into every interaction that you have in this world. That is the only way you create true freedom, and is the only way that you reach out and connect with the people that you're supposed to be surrounded by.
Incredible. Guys, we'll get that book shared down. I've read it probably half a dozen times. I think the first time I wasn't ready for it, so you got to be ready for this type of work to have that book actually speak to you. I would push back a little bit on what Annie said. I think make the Bible your Bible and make this the next book after the Bible. But no, David Dida's work is truly incredible, guys. This book is jam-packed. You're going to learn so much more about yourself. You're going to learn about the dynamics of polarity between that masculine and feminine. It's a real actionable tool. So refresh it to me. It's a book I need to refresh myself on 2023. So Annie, thank you so much for today. Brought so much just knowledge and wisdom and just insight into understanding ourselves, more understanding how the trauma plays a role in our relationships, how we can begin to process and heal through some of these things. So guys, make sure to follow Annie on Instagram at North Star Annie. Make sure to check out episode 136. If you're getting value out of this, guys, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, we doubled down this year. We're no longer once per week. We're going to be 100 episodes every Monday and Thursday, guys. And it's all because we've seen tremendous growth and feedback from you guys. So if you're getting value out of these, make sure to share this episode with somebody. Leave a 5-star rating and review. But for Annie, Frank Richard, guys, it's Superhuman Life. We love you, and we'll see you next week.